Once again, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight, we are going to be hearing from maritime historian and author, Charles H. Lagerbom. He has been with us before. He told us about his book that was published last year by Arcadia Publishing called Whaling in Maine. We also had a wonderful presentation by Charles about a topic that he did, a research vessel Hero, and that was an incredible program too. If you're interested in seeing either of those, they are available on the Camden Public Library program's YouTube channel, and you can watch those. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about Charles, because I think really, and I've probably said it before, he's one of the most interesting people that I've ever met. And granted, I've only met him virtually, but he is a tremendously interesting person. And he wrote a very cool book that we're going to learn about tonight called Maine to Cape Horn, the world's most dangerous voyage. And he actually traveled down to Cape Horn. So we're going to get to hear a little bit about that. So Charles is an AP US history teacher at Belfast Area High School, and he lectures and teaches on land, on sea, and actually on Zoom, as you are all here to enjoy this evening. Without further ado, let me go ahead and turn the program over to Charles so we can get started. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you very much. Let me get my presentation going. Okay, well, yes, Maine to Cape Horn. Great information that I found. The most dangerous journey in the world. This is kind of like a continuation of my research from whaling in Maine. In fact, it kind of led me right to it. When I was researching the whaling ships, I found that many of them had gone around Cape Horn to get to the South Sea whaling grounds. And they had great accounts of pulling their way around Cape Horn. And I thought, wow, this is a pretty great story. And so it was kind of just the natural extension of this Maine maritime story that I thought, well, what about other ships, other Maine connections with Cape Horn? So that's what brought up this second research topic and eventually resulted in this book. Here you see a picture of me. I'm doing, quote, research down in a Port Stanley pub in the Falkland Islands. And that's where I came upon some Maine shipwrecks, actually, that have since been returned to Maine, like the Snow Squall, but we'll get to that as well. But every time I turned around, there was a Cape Horn connection, and that's what I found really cool. In fact, every time I spoke to somebody about this, they suggested, hey, you should check out this, or you should do this. And it seemed like every time I shook the tree, something new came out about Maine and Cape Horn. And one of the first things I noticed was the geography of the place. Cape Horn shares an exact line of longitude with Cutler, Maine, which I thought was pretty cool. 67 degrees west longitude, a straight line distance of 8,000 miles. And with that connection, that's where the ships are going from the East Coast, especially to either the South Sea whaling grounds or the West Coast, once gold is discovered out in California. But what is it about Cape Horn, or what exactly is this region down there? Well, it's the end of the continental landmass of South America. Okay, we have the Straits of Magellan, which we'll get to in a moment. The Portuguese explorer who was sailing for Spain sailed down through the straits that bear his name. He thought he was at the end of the planet, but it took someone else to go even farther. But what else do we have down there? We have the Beagle Channel, famous for where Charles Darwin in the Beagle went through on his way to the Galapagos Islands and his theories of evolution. You have Staten Island and Lemaire Strait off the point of South America. And then you have Cape Horn itself. You even have a Cape Horn, which I found really interesting. And that kind of came into play for eastbound ships. Okay, well, some of the history, obviously Magellan was one of the first Europeans to work his way down along the South American continent. And in the 1520s, he got as far south as the Straits of Magellan. Took him about a month to get through the straits, entered into a pretty calm ocean that he named the Pacific Ocean. And then he continued on for the first circumnavigation of the planet. So the Straits of Magellan kind of became the way to go. And then in the middle, you see a picture of Sir Francis Drake. In 1578, about 50 years later, he took the Golden Hind. It took him 18 days to get through the Straits. Great weather. But when he got out into the Pacific, storms blew him way to the south. And we'll get to that in a moment. So the Straits of Magellan kind of figure into the history of Cape Horn itself. When I was down there, we were at the Punta Arenas, which is on the Straits of Magellan. And I wanted to see how cold the waters were. So there's a picture of me kind of standing there ankle deep. And yes, I can say those are pretty cold waters. I also took this picture in the Straits of Magellan, and it was showing that the weather is very changeable. It came in very quickly. It was a kind of a nice day, but very soon it turned pretty stormy. And I can't imagine taking a sailing ship through a narrow passage like that. You see a satellite image of the Straits of Magellan. And so that figured kind of prominently. Many ships in the later days of sail that we're going to talk about went down and around Cape Horn rather than to try to get through the narrow passages of the Straits of Magellan. Some with main connections are going to go through there, and we'll mention a little bit of them as well. But that's just one of the ways to get around this end of the continent. So here's Francis Drake, and the storms blew him so far to the south that historians are kind of torn on whether he actually sighted Cape Horn or not. They definitely gave his name to this stretch of water, though, that separates Cape Horn and the Antarctic Peninsula. It's called the Drake Passage. And when you cross that on your way to Antarctica, you either get what's called the Drake Lake, meaning it's very calm, or you get the Drake Shake, meaning you got really bad storms. So we're kind of torn historically on whether he discovered Cape Horn or not, because he did describe an island, but he didn't describe it fully enough for people to say, oh yeah, that was definitely Cape Horn. It fell to a Dutchman actually by the name of Willem Schouten, who was the first to actually see, chart, and log the idea of Cape Horn. He sailed down in two little tiny ships, one called Horn, which was named after his hometown and named after the businessman of his hometown who financed his voyage. So when he saw this end piece of land, he called it Cape Horn after the town in Holland. So he went through there about 1616. In fact, his assistant, one of the navigators, was a man by the name of Jacob Lemaire. His father had helped finance the voyage as well. And so he's going to give his name to the Straits of Lemaire that you see over on the right, which is the narrow strip of water between Staten Island and the mainland of South America. Many sailing ships are going to try to shoot that gap because you can save better time than having to go out and around Staten Island. Others are going to play it even more safe and go completely out and around. But we'll talk about how difficult it was. Now for Schouten, he didn't even know if Cape Horn was an island or not. You see his map of the drawing of it because the weather was so bad down there. He barely got some glimpses of the island as he worked his way around. And he had to tack back and forth and back and forth. And we'll talk about why he had to do that. But what is actually Cape Horn? Well, a tiny island right down at the end of the continental landmass. It sticks out into the Drake Passage. And right now, the Chileans have a station up there basically to retain possession of it and to keep the Argentines from claiming it. And that's its own nice little history of squabbles between those two countries over this area. This little research station is basically just a little post office. It's a little tourist stop. You see one of my acquaintances with the U.S. Antarctic, he was stopped there. You can get patches there and you can get stamps. I climbed up the steps in 1992. They added this large memorial, 7 meters high. It's a sculpture by a Chilean artist named Jose Balsos. It's got 10 steel plates. They're 6 millimeters thick. And if you notice, it shows kind of a flying albatross on its side. The dedication is to the memory of the men of the sea from every nation that lost their lives fighting against the merciless forces of nature of the Southern Ocean that prevail in the vicinity of the legendary Cape Horn. It's a really cool monument. It's built to withstand 125 mile per hour wind gusts, but in 2014, winds knocked it over. So they exceeded the 125 miles per hour. This is me off the Cape Horn on a fairly decent weather day. It doesn't really look it, but it kind of was. I do remember thinking though, my gosh, the place just weighs very heavy on you, very melancholy. And I don't know if it was the weather. I don't know if it was just the extreme end of the line of the continent, fin del mundo, literally the end of the world. But that's where, so much action has occurred in Cape Horn, in these ships trying to get around this point of land. Well, James Cook successfully followed in Schutten's tracks, but the later Englishman, Captain Bligh, aboard the HMS Bounty, along with Mr. Christian, no mutiny yet, they tried to get around Cape Horn, but they couldn't. The winds were so bad and blew them continuously backwards that they were so frustrated. In 1788, they decided to go around the Cape of Good Hope, the end of Africa instead, to reach the Pacific. So it even foiled Captain Bligh. Why is it so stormy though? Good question, because this is what Mainers and Maine-built ships and everything are going to face. It's where the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans meet in one writhing mass, actually. This meeting of the waters produces an extreme low pressure system, which is the hallmark of treacherous seas. As you can see, Cape Horn and the Antarctic Peninsula even act as like a funnel, and the winds that scream around the Antarctic continent do not have any lands to stop these winds. So they're always moving in this clockwise rotation. So they're always out of the west, and there is nothing stopping them. And so you have storms all the way around the continent and then being funneled right through Cape Horn. The storms are called graybeards or Cape Horn snorters. The winds are known as willowas and woolies, and there's lots of them all. Welcome to the furious 50s or the screaming 60s. The area receives precipitation 278 days of the year. It produces an annual rainfall total of over 80 inches. That's over 7 feet of water. The average temperatures hover around 40 degrees, which may sound balmy, but in the rain, in the cold, in the wind, no, it's not good. So what are the sailing directions to get around Cape Horn? Whatever you do, make westing. Just make westing. So you're tacking back and forth into these terrific winds into your teeth, trying to get westward around Cape Horn. If you're from New York going to like California or to the South Pacific whaling grounds. So they come out of the west on uninterrupted circles of the planet. This is a photo of Jack London. He actually wrote a short story called Make Westing. And it was based upon his time going around Cape Horn on the Maine-built down Easter Dirigo, when he was going from New York to San Francisco with his wife. They went by way of Cape Horn. So got to make westing, whatever you do. So you work your way down. So the phrase becomes, how do you round Cape Horn or double Cape Horn, or what that even mean? Cape Horn begins technically at 50 degrees south latitude. So if we're coming down by ship and we cross 50 degrees south latitude on the east side of South America, we have started the clock. And this is where they start counting days. If you can get down and around Cape Horn and then up and cross the 50 degree south line on the western side, you have rounded or doubled Cape Horn, okay? And some of the best passages were like 10 days, 12 days, 2 weeks. Those are phenomenally fast passages. And those became bragging rights. If you could get around Cape Horn in that short a time, you were considered very fortunate. Why does it take longer than that usually? Because you have to keep tacking back and forth. And here you see one of the routes of a French ship actually trying to get around the Horn. You see the constant winds with the arrows. The heavier thick line is the actual route. The thinner line was the captain's notations, and then he later plotted it more accurately. But you see The winds are always blowing you back. Here are more that are trying to get around Cape Horn. Not easy with the continuous westward wind pushing you back to the east. This is my most interesting one I found because it's from the route of a Maine-built ship, a downeaster called the Edward Sewell. And the captain was Captain Richard Quick. In 1914, he tried to get around Cape Horn, and there wasn't anything quick about it. It took him 67 days to get around Cape Horn. They crossed 50 degrees south on March 7th and recrossed it on the western side on May 12th. He had to take 54 different course corrections. He covered 20,000 running miles. The entire voyage lasted 293 days. It took them 67 days to double the Horn, and he logged 5,000 miles, which is 3 times the normal distance. So this was one of the slower passages around Cape Horn. So it's not just the winds that are slowing you down. There are a lot of other things you encounter off Cape Horn. One is a rogue wave. Rogue waves off Cape Horn have measured as high as 98 feet. They strike without warning. If the entire port or starboard side of your vessel is submerged, it could literally drag the ship over and under. Besides rogue waves, you have to use ropes to navigate your way around the deck. Treacherous footing when the seas are washing over here. You get washed overboard very easily, and we'll talk about some of those examples. This is a photo of the author Richard Henry Dana Jr., who wrote 2 years before the mast. And I love his quote. He said, "We found a large black cloud rolling on towards us from the southwest, blackening the whole heavens. 'Here comes Cape Horn,' yelled the chief mate, and we had hardly time to haul down and clew up before it was upon us. In a few moments, a heavier sea was raised than I had ever seen before, and as it was directly ahead, our little brig, which was no better than a bathing machine, plunged right into it, and all the forward part of her was underwater. The seas pouring in through the bow ports and hawse hole and over the nightheads, threatening to wash everything and everyone overboard. In the lee scuppers, it was up to a man's waist." Here you see a photo of a model of a ship called the SD Carleton. In February of 1890, this Maine-built ship went around Cape Horn. It was pooped by a monstrous wave. What does that mean? If you're pooped by a wave, that means the wave comes up over your stern and it sweeps the entire length of your ship. Such a wave could easily destroy the ship's steering gear. SD Carleton's wheelhouse and wheel were totally smashed and its compass washed away. The mate was killed, one helmsman broke his arm, and the other was knocked unconscious by the spinning wheel. The captain was from North Haven, Captain Edwin T. Amesbury. He improvised a wheel, fashioned his own steering compass, and successfully completed the Cape Horn voyage. Now, if you're exposed to the seas out there, a lot of times it takes 2 helmsmen to man the wheel. Sometimes you get thrown off it. They've been belted to the deck so that they could stand at their positions in bad weather. So let's talk a little bit about false Cape Horn, like I was telling you about. Eastbounders had to worry about false Cape Horn. Okay, if you're coming around from the Pacific to the Atlantic side, false Cape Horn was there because on a map, false Cape Horn and Cape Horn look nothing like each other. Cape Horn is a high promontory on a small island. False Cape Horn is a point of land off a large peninsula. But in crummy weather, barely glimpses of land, they often look alike. So if you're heading eastbound and you get a glimpse of land, you might think that that is Cape Horn, in which case then you turn northwards. Well, if you turn northwards after seeing that and it was the false Cape Horn, you're going to turn right into the Wollaston Islands. And that's what happened to a Maine-built ship, the Perry, in 1905. It was built in Damariscotta, 265-ton, 3-masted bark. It was eastbound, bad weather obscured visibility, but a break in the storm allowed the men a quick glimpse of some land. They thought it was Cape Horn, so they made the turn, but it turned out to be false Cape Horn. When another break occurred, they saw that they had land to their south. And that's bad because there was supposed to be no land to your south if you had done it correctly. So they recognized their predicament. There was little room to maneuver. The captain ordered a lifeboat ready with provisions, They tried a starboard tack, but it was too late. So they resumed their eastward course, and in very bad weather, they had no choice but to aim between reefs and hope they might safely beach on some island. To their surprise, Perry scraped through a narrow gap in the kelp-covered reef and entered the waters east of Deceit Island, safely east of true Cape Horn. They had miraculously navigated their way through this narrow gap. Incredible story. You had to worry about ice. Icebergs down along Cape Horn and into the Drake Passage. The Thomaston-built ship Joseph Spiney rounded Cape Horn in early December and found itself amongst islands of ice. Altering course time and time again, they sailed among the icebergs for the next 2,000 miles. The floes were miles long and many were 100 feet high. Occasionally they would thin out, but there were always some around. At worst, it was crowded around them completely. It took 50 days for them to clear the ice. Here you see a picture of the Rockland-built clipper Red Jacket encountered massive ice floe at the Horn, and it was captured in a J.B. and Smith & Son illustration. It was also immortalized on iron stoneware and plates and stuff, one of which is in the Maine Maritime Museum. One of the ships built in Freeport, the San Joaquin, collided with an iceberg that measured 9 miles long. The collision partially dismasted them, stove in their bow, and grounded them up on the ice. The crew had to work frantically through the night until they were able to rock the ship off the ice and continue on their way. What else could happen? You have a chance of your cargo breaking loose and shifting around in the hold. And that's what happened to the 1,336-ton Maine-built Queen of the Pacific. Her iron water tank ruptured and shifted in her hold. They had no fresh water. The crew was allowed only 1 pint of fresh water daily until they could reach port 3 weeks later. The Maine-built bark, Frank Curling, was out of Cardiff, headed to San Francisco around Cape Horn with a cargo of coal when it sank off Cape Horn during a hurricane. The cargo shifted. Her captain, namesake of the ship, had tried to make too fast a time and had too much sail on there. And it made the ship rock so much that cargo shifted and it turned turtle completely over, the Frank Curling. The crew was lost, although Captain Curling himself survived it. And then you see on the bottom there picture a Waldoboro-built ship, the Emily Reed. In 1885, her cargo shifted off Cape Horn, which sprung the ship's spars, and most of its fresh water was lost. An ordeal they barely survived. You could also lose your rudder, in which case it's very difficult to make way, and that could be almost darn near fatal. And so this is where I introduce Albert Nichols Blanchard, one of the most famous of the Searsport captains. Okay, one time he went around Cape Horn. He found that his cargo was on fire, and I can imagine trying to battle the flames while you're fighting storms around Cape Horn, but he did. On another voyage aboard the Herbert Black, he lost his rudder in Cape Horn waters, so he jury-rigged one. He succeeded in building a jury-rigged rudder. He rounded the Cape Horn, reached his destination. He called on a bunch of different ports on the West Coast. He returned around Cape Horn to New York, all under the same juried rudder. And this is a feat that captains have been saying hasn't been equaled since. And I guess the scars made by the chains controlling this improvised rudder were you could see on the Herbert Black for many years afterwards. I'm just trying to imagine what it must have been like to be ordered up these rigging and out onto these spars to bring in sail while the ship's wildly swinging back and forth. But it was basically just your job. And that's what amazed me over and over again. These Mainers did it. It was just part of their job. Here is a book called Cape Horn by Felix Reisenberg. He sailed aboard a Maine-built ship, the A.J. Fuller, and he wrote about his time getting called out of his berth. He said, "Hang on. Oh, God, my mouth was full of salt water. Black, cold seas, solid ocean was lifting us, sweeping the gang along the lee side of the house into the waist. Running ropes streamed across the deck. The water was filling our oilskins, our boots, wetting our shirts up under our armpits. The slippery deck rose and she ascended to windward, hitting us, knocking us down. Another flash, followed by close reverberating thunder, deadened our hearing. The white fire has for an instant lit a picture of indescribable confusion and speed. And then the first mate grabs him and orders him aloft. He says, cold bodies were forgotten. Fingernails were broken off and bleeding. No one knew. We smothered the bulge of the sail, the screaming of the wind, and the cut of the sleet were our thunderous applause. The mighty tossing of the ship, exaggerated because of our height, gave grandeur to our victory. We had saved the topsail. One of my favorite stories is by this guy, a Searsport native, Captain Charles Melvin Nichols. He was a captain of a Maine-built bark called the Patmos in 1876. He loaded a cargo of coal in Hull, England, and he sailed for Valparaiso, Chile, around Cape Horn. The 739-ton Patmos had been built in Bucksport, actually, in 1859, 144 feet long. Nichols was on his honeymoon with his wife, Millicent, and a daughter of a pretty famous Searsport captain himself. While off Cape Horn, Patmos started to catch fire, though, spontaneous combustion. The icy wet deck soon warmed with the heat, and the pitch began to melt. The oakum underneath already had burned out. The wooden hatches coverings collapsed under the pounding of the Cape Horn waves. Nichols timed it perfectly, got the lifeboats ready, got them provisioned, and then launched the ship just as the Patmos sank. So they're out there bailing for their lives, and another ship comes along. It's called the Pasithea from England. It too was hauling coal to Valparaiso, Chile. They brought Nichols and his crew on board, and then the storm got worse. And the captain of the Pasithea lost his nerve. So Nichols took over command of the new ship, the Pasithea, and with the help of his crew and the Pasithea's crew, they managed to save the ship and get around Cape Horn. Nichols was 25 years old at the time. Great story. A crewman of his once said that Nichols never lost a spar on any of his Cape Horn voyages after the Patmos adventure. When told that, Nichols replied, well, yeah, but I did blow away my share of sails. And that was always in just about every log and record book I could see, the sails were blown out trying to round Cape Horn. Getting dismasted is another problem. The SD Carleton we had spoken of earlier, it happened to it again. And this was documented by a passenger aboard, a 15-year-old who was going around the Horn to California. And he wrote home about how the ship got dismasted and that the waves were washing over and you couldn't walk the deck without holding on to something. Here's some more wreckage of ships. The snow squall that I told you about that ended up in the Falkland Islands, pieces of it brought back to Maine. That's its picture of what's back at the Maine Maritime Museum down in the lower right. And that's a model of the ship on the lower left. But it definitely had atrocious weather off the Horn and got dismasted. It took on more water than usual. They lost in quick succession. They lost their main topmast, their main top gallant mast, the main topsail yard, the main top, and the main trestle trees. The crew spent several hours hacking at the tangle down the deck and trailed over the side. And while it trailed over the side, the snow squall swung wildly in the wind and water. The captain feared the banging of the rigging against the side of his ship was going to burst through the side of the ship. They limped back into Montevideo, Uruguay for repairs, and then tried to get around Cape Horn again. They finally arrived in San Francisco after a voyage of 208 days. Eventually, it's going to get lost, or it's going to get damaged on a Cape Horn voyage, and then it's going to be beached at the Falkland Islands until about the 1980s when pieces of it were brought back to Maine. I want to introduce this guy. This is Captain Harvey Mills from St. George, Maine. About 1847 painting of him from the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath. In the 1840s, you could tell a Mainer who was a Cape Horner because they wore a gold earring in their left ear. Having doubled the horn, you could also put one foot up on the dining room table when you're eating. I thought that was pretty interesting. And you could put both feet up there if you also had doubled the Cape of Good Hope. So I thought, this is pretty interesting. So why the earring, the gold earring? Was it just kind of a thing to show other people, but it had a more practical purpose as well. Not only did it testify to the success at surviving a Cape Horn voyage, but it also would pay for your burial should your body ever be found if you got washed overboard off Cape Horn. It would be enough to cover any graveside charges. Harvey Mills was a pretty interesting guy. He went to sea at the age of 12, and he was captain by 25. In 1872, right before he retired as an old man as a captain, he brought the ship Eliza McNeil that you see the painting of and then the photograph of. The photograph is in Thomaston, actually, where the ship was built. The painting is of the Eliza McNeil rounding Cape Horn. But he brought it there around Cape Horn in 1872 from New York to San Francisco in 119 days, which is pretty respectable. Very few ships, in fact, only a few clipper ships made it under 100 days around Cape Horn from the East Coast to the West Coast. Once California discovers gold in 1848 and the 49ers head out the following year, Cape Horn becomes a big rite of passage for many of the ships heading out there. This is a Belfast ship called the Suliat, built in Belfast. It came off the ways right in time for gold fever, and the owner, Asa Fonts, quickly sold out 50 berths aboard the ship of local young men from Belfast and Camden and Bangor who wanted to get to the West Coast. They all paid $150 per share, which was pretty good money back then. 24 of them came from Bangor, including 3/4 of the town's Bangor quartet. I guess the fourth one didn't want to go. On April 16th, 1850, Suliat encountered bad weather off Cape Horn. The captain was a guy named Simpson, and his son, Edwin Simpson, was 18-year-old, was standing right beside him off Cape Horn. The ship gave a sudden lurch and Edwin was washed over the seas, and there was no way for the ship to stop and go back to get him. And many of the people heading to California said it was horrible to see the poor boy, bobbing in the water, quickly being left behind. And this basically ruined Simpson. He continued on, got them to California, but pretty much ended his sailing days. He returned to Belfast, built Simpson's Wharf, which he engaged in commerce, but never went to sea again after that. And this is the church up in Bangor on Hammond Street. Most of the guys going to California all met there and had a big church sermon. It was a big send off. In fact, the governor of Maine even came to Belfast to say goodbye to the ship. And you see the watercolor by an unknown artist, actually, of the Suliat. And then the stereoscopic view is of Simpson's Wharf. Many ships built in Maine, got around Cape Horn to get to the California either gold fields or to haul material out there. For the Transcontinental Railroad, most of the rails that the Central Pacific, the railroad company starting from San Francisco and working its way eastward, most of the rails were brought around Cape Horn by ships from the East Coast, many of them built in Maine. You see the Mary Robinson, the Flying Scud, the North American. They all have great stories of trying to get around the Horn in record time, in fighting horrible weather around there. The King Philip was successful in getting around the Horn, but then sank within sight of San Francisco. It wrecked on Ocean Beach, just outside of the city, and broke apart. It's one of those shipwrecks that the sands uncover every so often, and the newspapers say, "Oh, that's where that is." And it was the King Philip, built in Maine. The Penobscot Marine Museum in Searsport has tons of journals and log books and stuff, many of them talking about Cape Horn and so forth, like the ship Alexander that you see here, or the Journal of PBF Bassett, talking about rounding Cape Horn and either being put to work as a crew or as a passenger, just trying to, not get seasick or to, in fear of your life. This is Searsport native Captain Bill Goodell Jr. He was awarded, a medal of bravery because in June of 1876, while aboard the Brown brothers in a furious storm off Cape Horn, he rescued a sailor named William Beach. The sailor was swept over the side by a wave. Without a thought, Goodell affixed a rope around himself, jumped overboard after him, and dragged him back. Very interesting. People doing stuff like that, doing the right thing. But interesting about Goodell, though, is that about 20 years later, he pleaded no contest in a Boston district court for restraining and flogging one of his crew while off Cape Horn, who refused to go aloft. And he was fined $350. He retired from the sea in 1895. This is the ship Ivanhoe, Belfast built, in its logbook, talking about going around Cape Horn, went around several times, again, for the West Coast Passage, carrying cargo. These are the Watts brothers from Thomaston, Captain Watts. They're fifth generation sea captains. They met up while off Cape Horn. They hadn't seen each other for 9 years. And they both loaded for the West Coast in Baltimore, but they missed each other by just a few hours. They both were headed to San Francisco. There was Captain Edward Watts of the Pactolus with a Thomaston built bark. He got dismasted in a hurricane off Cape Horn. And so he was there fixing his ship, repairing it, and the winds dissipated. It's one of the few accounts I can find where there's no wind whatsoever. So the ships are becalmed. And he saw 2-3 miles away another ship, and it turned out to be his brother, Seymour Watts, who was captain of the John McDonald. And they signaled to each other, and eventually Seymour Watts rowed over, spent the afternoon with his brother. His wife didn't come with him, but the two brothers got to talk and everything like that. Seymour Watts returned to his ship, and then a storm came up, separating the two vessels. Edward Watts and Pactolus arrived in San Francisco, but John McDonald and Seymour Watts and his wife were never seen again, lost at sea. Edward Watts died at 69 years old in 1913. And this is the Watts family plot in the Thomaston Cemetery. This is a model of a ship, the Alfred D. Snow. Went around Cape Horn a bunch of times. In fact, this model was built while off Cape Horn, presented to the daughter of the ship captain, Captain William Wiley. And the storms were so bad around Cape Horn that they had to veer so far west that when they got around South America, their first stop was at Pitcairn Island, way off course. In fact, that's where the Bounty, the mutineers ended up. They stopped there for fresh water after their trip around the Horn because storms blew them so far off it. The Alfred D. Snow went on to become a terrible shipwreck off Ireland later on, spawning many songs and stuff like that about it. And one of the more sadder stories I found was about a captain named Edwin Harriman from Belfast, and the ship, the P.R. Hazelton. It was built in Belfast. It was a Cape Horner, went around Cape Horn a couple times. Edward Horace Harriman, the captain, sailed down with his family. Storms were so bad, he decided to cut into the Wollaston Islands for protection from the storms and ended up wrecking. The ship sank in about 20 feet of water, and he spent the next 10 years trying to get the cargo back and trying to rescue it. And it ended up actually breaking him mentally. He went mad and ended up his days over in Augusta in the mental institution. His home that you see a photo of there at one point was a bed and breakfast that was known locally as the Mad Captain's House. Very tragic story. This was in Tierra del Fuego, right before the Horn. The picture you see of me in the left corner is right off the Wollaston Islands. I was trying to look for the site of this wreckage because I guess there's still some remains to it. Most of the cargo did get found and brought back by other people, other salvagers and stuff. But some remnants of the ship are supposedly still there, but I didn't see it on my trip through. And then there's Captain Jesse Thayer Carver in the St. Mary. He's a Searsport captain. St. Mary was built in Phippsburg. 1890, he sailed from New York City on its maiden voyage. They collided with another ship off Cape Horn on a pretty clear night. But Carver had gone below deck, and the second mate messed up, I guess, in the collision. So he tried to get the ship back to the Falkland Islands to at least save the cargo. And he ended up wrecking even before he could get to Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands. And the shipwreck is still down there. It's on a beach called, at a place called Whale Cove. It's known as the Christmas wreck because it carried a whole bunch of metal toy trains that were for San Francisco kids. But the Falkland Islander kids had some great Christmases for a couple years after that, using the toy trains there. And Carver was the only fatality from this wreck. He refused to go with the rest of the crew when they went to get help. And a couple days later, they came back and they found him dead. And they're not sure if it was suicide or if the stress of losing everything, because he had wagered his entire life savings to be a part owner of the vessel and basically lost it all with the wreck, or when he couldn't even save the cargo. In the 1970s, almost like the snow squall, teams from the the Maine State Museum went down and brought back pieces of the St. Mary. And here you see them. It's part of the Maine State Museum. If you go over there, you can see that. It's the part of the St. Mary that's there. The ceremonial sword is Carver's. That's in the Penobscot Marine Museum. The Falkland Islands celebrate the wreck on their stamps. And Carver's body was brought back to Maine, and he's buried in Elmwood Cemetery in Searsport. In fact, Penobscot Marine Museum offers a lot of stuff about Cape Horn. This piano went around Cape Horn a bunch of times. They have seaman's chests, sailor chests that did the Cape Horn voyages. A lot of log books. This Cape Horn pigeon that was stuffed is part of their collection as well, and that was prepared by one of the crewmen aboard a ship that went around Cape Horn. They also have a ton of paintings. Like my original slide was of the Henry B. Hyde, a Maine-built ship going around Cape Horn. That was a 1933 oil painting. And then this is a clipper ship in heavy squall by James Butterworth. And that's in the Penobscot Marine Museum as well. So over and over again, every time I shook the tree, more connections came up. And finally, Searsport is famous with Lincoln Colcord, who was actually born off Cape Horn. His father was Lincoln A. Colcord, and his wife went into labor off Cape Horn during a storm, and Lincoln was born in 1883. He died age 64 in 1947. He was instrumental in getting the Penobscot Marine Museum going. He's also buried in Elmwood Cemetery, actually not too far from Jesse Carver. He's also known for writing the words to the Maine Stein Song for the University of Maine, which was popularized by another Mainer, Rudy Valley. So what ended the Cape Horn passages, though? It was basically the Panama Canal. That shaved 8,000 miles off a voyage between New York and California, or vice versa. You didn't have to go down and around South America. You didn't have to face bad Cape Horn weather. And that pretty much put the kibosh to any sailing ships being financially viable. They just couldn't compete with the Panama Canal. One of the last Maine-built square riggers that I could find that went around Cape Horn was the Kulani in December of 1941. In fact, the crew, listening to a little transistor radio aboard the ship, heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor while they were off Cape Horn. They were carrying Douglas fir from Aberdeen, Washington to Durban, South Africa, and they did a west to east rounding of Cape Horn. It was an iron bark built in Bath in 1899. And that was one of the last of the ship's square riggers to go around Cape Horn that I found with Maine connections. This is a more modern connection. The National Science Foundation research vessel Hero that I spoke on earlier, also instrumental in Cape Horn waters. You see the photo of it crossing the Drake Passage there, built in Maine. Why I include it with my other information about ships in Cape Horn was that on its way back after being decommissioned in its final season of service, it's sailing back from the Antarctic Peninsula. It's approaching Cape Horn. The weather turns bad and the engines give out. And so the captain, Captain Lenny, used sails to bring the ship around Cape Horn, which I thought is kind of a fitting ending to Maine's connections with sailing ships going around Cape Horn. And then the lower right photo is its current status out in Willapa Bay, Washington, the Oregon line. Pretty sad fate for such a pretty historic vessel. I want to thank a lot of the people who helped me with this. Many are no longer with us. Many have helped in all kinds of different ways. And I'm always interested in hearing more from people of other connections and so forth. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. I appreciate you doing that talk. And again, I want to remind folks, this is all a bunch of research that he did for a new book that has just been published by Arcadia Publishing called Maine to Cape Horn, the World's Most Dangerous Voyage. Let's just jump into some questions. So if anyone in the audience has questions, you can go ahead and type it into the Q&A box. You can find that down at the bottom of your screen for most of you. While we wait for a couple questions to go in, I had one. You had mentioned the length of the trips, the amount of time it takes to get around Cape Horn.
Yep.
I'm not that familiar with the geography down there, especially the historic geography. Were there ports in Chile or Argentina where the crews could stop and do repairs or restock supplies during that trip?
Not in the very far south, and that was the problem. Unless you wanted to go into the Straits of Magellan and maybe go to Punta Arenas, or maybe the Beagle Channel where like Ushuaia might be, that sort of thing. There really was nothing. So you either went all the way back up to like Montevideo, which is almost halfway up South America, or over to the Falkland Islands on the east side, or you made it to Valparaiso, Chile on the west side. And that made a stretch. That was a long distance if your ship was in pretty serious disrepair. Made it very difficult, or if you were short on water or provisions or manpower or whatever. I mean, there were some ships I found that they were debilitated, not even by storms, but by like maybe cholera went through the crew or something. And so there were only like 4 guys to operate the ship, things like that. So it wasn't always just weather that proved to be a challenge around Cape Horn.
Yeah, I mean, your talk really, it just forces one to marvel at the bravery and the skill of the sailors to be able to navigate in the conditions like in the, paintings and the photos that you showed. And again, also just, a big round of applause for the shipbuilders who were able to build vessels. And again, you showed a lot of, damages, but my goodness, so many were able to successfully get through. Just phenomenal.
Yeah, the ships really took a beating. I mean, but they were very strong and sturdy, especially the clipper ships that tried to get through faster than normal, and then the later larger down easters, a lot of them Maine built.
Yes, excellent. So Mary Jane has a couple great questions. The first one, she wants to know a little bit more about the photographs. Where are those photographs from that you used throughout the slideshow? And is there any information about who took the photographs?
Yeah, a lot of them. I have them all like annotated for like the book or for my talks and stuff. Many of them were by people who recognized, excuse me, just how difficult the challenge was. And so many were taken by like the daughter of the captain or, by people on board the ship. There's a famous film actually shot in the 1920s about one of the last times a square rigger went around Cape Horn. And it was made because they knew that this was kind of like the end of an era that, and to describe, oh yeah, we faced a storm off Cape Horn. The descriptions just don't do it justice. And even the logbooks are pretty matter of fact. It's like, yes, we had a rogue wave, but to see the photographs, which I think are just remarkable, and many of these are from just, Cape Horn books, and like Felix Reisenberg's book that I showed and stuff like that. And the Penobscot Marine Museum let me use a lot of those photographs and illustrations, as did like the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath.
Super. She also wants to know, do you have any information about if climate change has impacted the weather of Cape Horn?
That's a good question. It's still a low depression area, so that's the hallmark of some pretty treacherous seas. The precipitation is still pretty much the same. I have not heard too much about that. I did just read recently that Antarctica just posted its like coldest winter ever. So, but with the climate changing, yeah, definitely. I mean, and that may have explained why sometimes there was ice down there and sometimes there wasn't. You just didn't know what you were going to get, but you knew you were going to have to be prepared for just about anything. And I think that's what was really incredible. The common theme through most of this research was that it was just part of the deal. They knew, okay, we have the doldrums, we have the equator, we have this, but we have Cape Horn, so we got to prepare and we got to do this and this. And you just knew that it was going to be tough. You kind of just took your beating and made the best you could through it.
Thomas asks, why didn't more ships use the Strait of Magellan?
Because it's very narrow, and they have the same like wild winds called willowaws that just swoop down. And especially with sailing ships, once you started to have more steam power, you could start making the argument, yeah, that makes a little sense. But when it was mostly just sailing, you don't have that much room to maneuver. In fact, you'd rather have that open Drake Passage where you could tack back and forth, rather than the narrow confines of the Straits of Magellan, or even the narrower confines of the Beagle Channel.
Yeah, we had a speaker a couple of weeks ago, Megan Frey, who was a young woman merchant mariner, and she had some video for us. She sails tall ships and had gone through the Drake Passage and had some incredible video footage, and just wild, absolutely wild. Audrey wants to know, when doing your research, what was your favorite sources or places where you got research from?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I went everywhere. I was in museums. I was like elbow deep into logbooks, and it was just incredible. So I would have to tip my hat to the two main museums, Maine Maritime in Bath and the Penobscot Marine Museum, but a lot of local historical societies were very gracious in opening their doors. The Thomaston Historical Society, the Belfast. I mean, I was not refused, entry into anything really. It was, in fact, they loved, somebody coming and asking questions about the local connections and so forth. And, I've been dragging my kids to cemeteries for years, and they'd be like, oh, Dad, not another cemetery. And I'm like, oh, but do you know who's buried here? And so I just would, I'd track a name like Jesse Carver, and I'd be like, all right, well, so where's he buried? And I'd find it. And it just kind of hit it home a lot more, kind of like an end to the story as well. You read about the research of what he did and so forth, but then to find, like the actual his resting place, I think is kind of part of the story as well.
And you had mentioned historical societies, so that feels like a good cue for me to bring up. If anyone would like to meet Charles and to purchase his book and get an autographed copy of his book, he will be appearing at the Camden Rockport Historical Society's Conway Homestead. That's on Route 1, kind of on the Camden Rockport line, this Saturday, October 9th from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. as part of a larger historical event that's going to be going on there all day. But he'll be there from 10 to noon. So please stop by and see Charles. We have a question from Judy, and it says, were the crew paid well in that time for risking their lives?
Another good question. were they paid well? I don't think so. From what I've been able to read, and there aren't that many crew member journals or, reminiscences or letters or things like that. They're more from the owners. They're more from the captains or the passengers or the mates, that's its own little interesting piece to it. But they earned enough, but the whole maritime industry was a tough life. I found that with my research into the whaling. Mm-hmm. At least with whaling, you got a share of the profit of, what you were able to capture and bring back. If you're a merchant, it's basically, you just got to get the stuff to point B, as fast and as cheap as possible. And so you're going to get kind of a flat rate regardless if it took you 200 days or 100 days. And so I don't think it was as good a deal, I would say, as a whaler.
I was envisioning and thinking about it when you were talking about, the cargo shifting in the hulls, and I'm imagining these, casks of whale oil just, rolling all around, possibly breaking open. And, oh, what a mess. Yeah. Okay, we can wrap up in just about a minute, but I want to just mention, folks, this is a program that we're doing as part of our Discover History Month at the Camden Public Library. So what that means is we're going to have extra history programming all month long. Yay! So if you enjoy talks like this, please visit librarycamden.org/events. You can find our calendar on our website, and it is chock full of some really cool history talks. And coming up on Thursday, we are going to have a talk by Bob Green, and it's called Black History of Maine. So it should be very interesting. I also want to thank our Discover History Month sponsors, the Camden River House Inn and Hotel, and also the Smiling Cow. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here tonight, Charles. This is once again an excellent, excellent talk, and I'm so glad that you took the time to spend with us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Mary Jane says, fascinating. Thank you for your passion. And yes, I agree. This was very fascinating. Again, I thank the rest of you who showed up tonight. Please tell your friends and family about this talk. If you enjoyed it, you can find it on the Camden Public Library Program's YouTube channel, along with 2 other programs that we did previously with Charles Lagerbom about the research vessel Hero and his previous book, Whaling in Maine. All right, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, Charles. I'll see you on Saturday. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.